am Aaron Wells. I teach literature, ancient history, Shakespeare, and intro to film. I would say that I am an early adopter of online education. I actually adopted online education as a student all the way back in the days of dial-up internet, and I have been doing that on and off ever since. I've taught many years in a physical school, in online context, and others. I would say that I have always loved learning and sharing knowledge. I think one of the things that I have particularly enjoyed is the experience of finding a work of ancient culture that's new to me, that's exciting, that's interesting, or perhaps an adaptation of something I was familiar with, and then sharing that process of discovery with others. That includes learning how it works, what it's all about, sort of the essence of the work, but also appreciating it and being able to connect it to other things around it. I would say that enjoyment of discovery is a big part of what drives me as a teacher, because that's something I get to share and experience with the students. And there's not many things that are more enjoyable as a teacher than getting to see the students when they really feel like a door is opened up for them into a new work of literature that they're probably going to be coming back to for the rest of their life. So in my courses, I try to focus on having a nice, steady reading load, try to keep things fairly consistent, and try to be predictable so the students know what to expect, what I'll be asking of them, and what their assignments will be. I try to keep the content focused on the authors or the movies or the adaptations that I am teaching. So I try to keep the focus on the details of that material and how the students are engaging with it. A lot of courses, when they do a literature survey, will do snippets, samples, small portions. As much as is possible, I like to read full works, be able to really appreciate the full thing. I will use smaller portions when it's not feasible to do the whole work, but if it's at all possible, I like to be able to go through the entirety of something like the Aeneid, to be able to appreciate all of the different parts of it, how it holds together, the way it works, how it builds to the main points that it's trying to reach, the way it structures the characters, the flow of the story. So all of the components that make it what it is as a great work of literature are things that I want the students to be able to understand and appreciate. When I am teaching, I try to use quizzes to help keep the students accountable on the reading, to be testing them on the material so that they are familiar with what they're reading through and what they're covering. I will also use written assignments, and that can include longer papers. It can also include shorter written assignments that are more responsive, like a discussion board question. And I try to use those written assignments to help them engage with the work beyond what's covered in class. That's especially the case with being able to answer questions maybe that came up that are a little bit harder to find a full answer for, that they get to explore themselves as they work through it in their writing. I really love all of the works that I teach. There's always a tremendous amount of stuff to discover in them. I try to present information as it's needed so the students are able to track with it. They're able to understand the material, understand the background, where it fits in. I try to provide sort of layers of material in terms of understanding what is the basics, what is it that's going on in the story, or what is it that's being done by the author. Do they know what's actually happening? And I try to make sure that the students are able to bring up or ask or have the questions answered if they're really getting confused or they're not tracking with what's going on. In addition to helping them understand the material sort of on that straightforward what happened level, I also want to help them be able to make connections, be able to understand an allusion, be able to see the artistry behind how the author presents their work, the metaphors that are being used, the way the characters are being sketched out, and all of that sort of thing. And I like to use the questions that those things raise as a way of continuing the exploration of the work. I try to raise questions as often as possible in class. That's a really good way to continue to push forward in the learning experience. It helps the students to realize, yeah, that part that I thought was weird is unusual or different than I expected. Why is that? And that becomes a real pathway, because curiosity is a big part of what helps us to explore something a little bit deeper. And those questions that we can formulate helps them push further into the work to be able to understand it on a deeper level. When they come to class, the students are expected to have completed the assigned readings. And I'm expecting them to be ready to engage on the ideas, to raise questions of their own, to be able to answer questions about what happened and who was doing what in the story and that sort of thing. When the class is over, they're free to complete the quizzes or other writing assignments that are due, which I usually have due at the end of the week. And I try to make sure that the schedule of those assignments is always very clear so the students always know what to expect. Once all those things are done, then they'll be free to start in on the reading assignment for the next week. All right, so that's a little bit about myself and the way I function as a teacher and what kind of things I try to help the students develop as part of the class. And this is just a little sample lesson that can walk through some steps of what Romanticism is, something that applies to several different classes that I teach. So when we come to a stage where we're starting to explore a particular group or a certain genre, oftentimes we need to consider the question of what is it that we're actually engaging with. So this is a term that can actually be a little bit tricky to nail down. What is romantic? It could be a number of things. For a literary context, we might expect a questing knight doing great deeds as a member of a famous ruler's court. So somebody from Arthur's Round Table or one of Charlemagne's 12 peers, that sort of thing. It could also be a story of star-crossed lovers who are fated never to be united, never to finally be able to be in a relationship. Examples of that would include something like Romeo and Juliet or Dido and Aeneas and some others. And there's different times where that became popular. It could also be a poem with an appreciation for a natural scene of great beauty. All of these are not just examples of what it could be, but actually very prominent examples of a pattern, a type of story, a genre that was really dominant at different points in time. So when we realize that there's multiple definitions, the next question becomes, well, what is correct? All of these can and have been called romantic at some time. So where do we go from there? And of course, this is because definitions can be tricky. They do change over time. A word like lecture, for example, you might be familiar with it as what I'm doing when I'm presenting information to you. The original meaning was based off of a reading where you lay out a book and the reading is done straight from the book, has nothing about sort of the oral presentation part of it that's necessarily inherent to the original meaning. So it can change over time. However, words can also keep an old meaning even when a new meaning shows up. So when a new meaning becomes common, the old meaning might still be there. You can actually see a process where this is occurring with a word like literally. Literally can be used as an intensifier, where the person says, I was literally there all day. They were actually not there all day, but they were using the word literally to give the sense that it was a really long time. But there's also an older sense in which literally means essentially to the letter. It's exactly what you said. And that older meaning and that newer intensifier meaning are both simultaneously being used in our culture. And that's part of the reason why a term like that can be confusing. Which one am I supposed to be understanding here? So often we have to examine the context in which the word is used to know how it's meant. If a friend is telling you how long they waited for their coffee at the coffee shop and they say it was literally 8 hours, you can probably be confident that they don't mean in the older term, literally as exactly 8 hours. And if they say, I was literally 15 minutes, it might be more specific. that might be something where they do mean it to be exactly that amount of time. And that can be based off of the context of the conversation. It could also be based off the person. If you know them and they're the kind of person to use that word in a certain way, that gives you information. So that can actually give us some helpful starting points for figuring out romanticism and romantic in a literary context. So there are some older definitions. These aren't going to be the ones that maybe we'll be using in the moment, but these are things that we can keep in mind. This is part of how the word came about. A lot of the original application of romance to a literary genre started as chivalric romance. The Rome portion of that is a reference to Rome as a setting. So medieval chivalric romance frequently thought of powerful rulers, important rulers, and courts, and Greco-Roman mythology as a sort of an outset of that, as part of what the proper setting for these kinds of stories were. And then the stories themselves tend to be centered around a quest being undertaken by a knight, often to gain a lady's favor. And so there's kind of a structure to it, but it could be set in a number of places. It could be set in Arthur's court with the Round Table. It could be set in, something much closer to what for them was present day England, like with Guy of Warwick, or it might be set in a very far off time, like Alexander the Great. In any of those cases, the story and the sort of adventure components of it, of what we would think of as an adventure or a quest story, that was the part that made it romance. So there was rules for the knight to follow. There was expectations and patterns to that story, but it takes the Rome part of the setting, and that becomes part of the description for the genre. As time goes on, that does begin to change. Romeo and Juliet is a very good example of how that really begins to alter. The romance of Romeo and Juliet is very clearly about the relationship between those two characters of Romeo and Juliet. It no longer is about the achieving of the quest. The relationship becomes the focus. There's an additional modification on this in the mid-1700s with a different genre that comes about. So we could call it a Gothic novel or Gothic romance, where they tend to use a setting which is very dramatic and bold. It often is in a setting that has medieval architecture or is in a medieval context, and often focuses on an innocent heroine who's being menaced by a cruel and lustful villain. And there's often elements of the supernatural, sensational about it. And so there's a number of things that fit into that mold. Those would be some older examples of kind of how it got used. But obviously you can see from these two examples that the definition is clearly drifting as time goes on. And they're not necessarily something where it can be pinned down to only one thing. And you can have these existing simultaneously alongside each other. So somebody could write a new story involving the accomplishment of great deeds, and it could be understood as a romance in the old style, but they could also write it in this Gothic setting with this new way of storytelling in a novel format, and that would be understood as well. So for the purposes here, we're going to be looking at romantic in a fairly specific context. It's partially a term for a very particular time frame of English literature from about 1789 or 1798 up to 1830, depends on exactly when you mark the starting point. And that includes certain authors who are included in that time period, but not necessarily included with the idea of what romanticism is. So someone like Samuel Taylor Coleridge would fit in there, but also someone like William Hazlitt, who's aware of romanticism, is responding to some elements of it, but isn't presenting himself as a romantic author in the way that Coleridge is, or Jane Austen, who has love stories, but she's not taking on board the elements of how stories are thought of, or the way poetry in particular is being thought of by an English poet like Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So there's people who fit into that time frame who maybe don't fit the exact term that we're talking about. So it's a term for a time frame. It's also a term for a group of poets who put forward a very specific idea of what poetry ought to be in particular, and they come to be known as the English Romantic poets. This isn't the only place where this happened, but there's a very particular group within England who really headlined this for English language poetry. So Wordsworth and Coleridge are a key component of that. They're people who are very heavily identified with it, including explaining what the idea of romanticism means to the people who are kind of on board with them. But it also sometimes includes other authors like Keats or Shelley or Byron. When we talk about their vision of poetry, there's a lot of attributes to it. But let's start with Wordsworth's definition in particular. He talks about poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So in some ways, this is a reaction to a world of unfeeling progress, the beginnings of industrialization, rationalism, and a world that felt stifling to people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, and a desire to push against that in a different direction, to engage the emotional side of experiencing life. So when Wordsworth looks at poetry, he sees a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. But that doesn't mean it's just whatever comes out. The poet is who gives shape to that overflow of powerful feeling and directs it into the poetry. So romantic poetry, as this period of poetry, is deeply invested in the individual, the poet in particular, and it would find inspiration from what the poet noticed that included a great deal of appreciation for the natural world, but it also included the classical world and a lot of different parts of life. It did have an emphasis on appreciating everyday life, but also far-flung stories from other places. But it in particular emphasized the uniqueness of the poet's experience. So a very good way to think about this is that before English Romanticism, poets and poetry could be thought of as holding a mirror up to life. It reflects life back to itself. So when you look at a great poem, you're seeing a reflection of life in some aspect. With Romanticism, you might say it's more of a lamp, the genius of the poet being an illuminator. And when you experience that poet's spontaneous overflow of feeling into their poem, that sheds light on life around you. It's still concerned with life. It still has a structure of poetry, but the intensity of experience that the poet is able to bring and then give expression to through his poetry becomes the way that you experience things more deeply. So it's a little bit complicated. There's several things that have gone into all of that, but it becomes something where there is kind of a sense of how poetry works that not only defines that period of time and those poets, but has come to be an undercurrent of how we think about art ever since.